This is going to be the best Pauper ban discussion video you have ever seen. How, you might ask? Well, we not only come to a conclusion which cards are probably best to ban or unban, but we will do so in a structured way. This includes figuring out what problems the format faces, how the format looks like, and based on that, setting goals and guidelines in order to evaluate cards in the format and on the ban list. Pauper does have a decent deck variety when looking at the best decks, but this variety only shows at the surface. While we have Izzet Terror, Teammate Terror and Mono Blue Terror, if you played against one of them, you know at least half of the deck and play patterns of the others. We have Giant Wildfire, Giant Brutescale, Golgari Brutescale, and Grixis Affinity. All of those do rely heavily on excessive card draw, fueled by Deadly Disputes and Ica Wellspring. So instead of building around different win cons and abilities, we just look at 4 different ways that compete against one another at who can exploit the ancestral recall of Pauper the best. Ferrix is a popular deck choice in the current meta because of the good matchup into Glee. But the deck literally is built to have a repetitive gameplay. Picking up the same spells that are sprite multiple times a game means you will see the card casted against you more times than you will cast your own cards in a whole tournament. So, if you look at Pauper from the outside, everything seems fine, but playing the format reveals that we are looking at nuances and not a diverse card pool. This has a few good implications. The format is easy to learn since you will encounter the same cards very often. The format is quite stable, as the current decks did rise to the top and utilize pushed cards designs efficiently. Currently, we do expect the meta to stay the same for a very long period of time. And the format rewards player skill and matchup knowledge, since games are decided by nuances and little things. Picking up on those and maximizing your cards will impact your results and lead to more wins. Yet, this stability comes at the cost of diversity and to some extent fun, as many players have voiced their displeasure of facing the same cards over and over again. Current meta staples are including straight-up design mistakes that should have never been printed, setting the bar for new cards to have an impact really high. A second effect is that the tier 1 and 2 decks are very far ahead of tier 3 decks in regard of power level. Since the established decks reconcile the most powerful engines with the most efficient payoffs, trying to use different engines or different threats will leave you with a noticeably less powerful deck. This is why current brewing is mostly optimizing existing strategies, finding side grades, swapping out one card package for a different one, or trying to reinterpret strategies. Part of all these negative talking points are fundamental problems for eternal formats. But since Modern Horizons 3, these problems gotten worse as top decks got straight upgrades, and the new combo deck of the format is more efficient than our previous options. This is why we want to discuss bans and unbans. Can we nudge the top decks down a bit to be more in line with the rest of the format? Can we introduce more variety of decks instead of looking at the same 4 decks, just differently dressed up? Alright, trying to address the top decks of the Pauper format requires that we know what decks are good and what decks are bad. How else can we be sure to address the correct decks or cards? Therefore, we will have to take a short look at what decks currently perform very well and which decks are underperforming. The best deck in the format is Golgari Glee. It has the best win rate out of all commonly played decks in MTGO challenges. Golgari Glee has a 53.6% win rate against other decks and the second best win rate of all commonly played decks online. This success can be replicated in in-person tournaments. We have only limited data for paper events, but recently were able to observe the whole field at Pauper Scream and Pauperfest in January, where Golgari Glee had the best win rates by far. Giant variants of Glee, surprisingly, do not come close to these numbers, and while still being a threatening deck, including Rhythm Crusaders on average seems to lower your win rate. And while Glee did dominate early this year, we also can see cracks in the MTGO challenge on February 21st, where Golgari Glee got a 29.63% win rate, while Giant got a 40% win rate. In the Pauper qualifier, Golgari was at 45.13%, but now Giant Glee won the event with a 73.53% win rate. These are only singular events, so these numbers are not the ground truth. We can see, no matter if you play red or not, Glee is a very strong deck, but not so strong that you cannot beat it. On average, when including very recent data, the win rate of Golgari Glee tanked a little bit compared to what it was earlier this year. Still performing exceptionally well online are Mono Blue Terror and Dimir Fairies. Mono Blue Terror sports a 52.98% win rate against other decks consistently since Modern Horizons 3, and therefore was the best deck for the second half of 2024. Only in 2025 it was overtaken by the now refined Golgari Glee lists. Dimir Fairies do overperform online at 55.99% win rate against other decks, and just like Mono Blue Terror, this isn't a fluke, but consistent since MH3. While the win rate might scare you, only few and dedicated players play Dimir Fairies. We can assume that the win rate isn't that scary if it would be played by more players, but we do have enough data to know that Dimir Fairies is indeed a good deck. Sadly, Dimir Ferret is not played enough in in-person events to make a statement about how it fares when playing against other people face to face. For Mono Blue Terror, on the other hand, we do have enough data, and we can see that it cannot replicate its success in paper tournaments. This is unexpected, considering the archetype is very established for a long time, and we expect pilots to be quite versed with the deck, eliminating some of the player's skill factor. A part of the lower win rate might come from a huge number of Mono Blue Fairy players, as the deck has a good matchup against Glee. It performs quite well in the paper tournaments, but has a harder time online. Another deck that was performing well in person was Junked Wildfire. Online, the win rate looked unremarkable at best, with a 46.7% win rate. The success at the beginning of the year, therefore, might just be personal skill and brewer's advantage, as we cannot justify calling Junked Wildfire a good deck based on MTG and challenge data. Finally, we have Kudosa Red and Grixis Affinity, which are very powerful decks, but in the face of Glee Combo, Terror, and Fairies cannot outperform the meta, so their win rates hover around 49 to 51% and do not go much higher or lower, online and in paper. To sum up this section, let's look at the strategies of decks we discussed now, and also fill the gaps with Dimir Terror, Ramp, White Weenie, Dredge, and Gardens. And no, just adding one creature to your combo deck doesn't magically transform it to a mid-range deck. Giant Glee is just like Golgari Glee, a combo deck. If a combo deck without interaction is beating you with just one creature, you probably need to re-evaluate your deck. Speaking of Glee, we can see that only Dredge and Glee are utilizing combos to win the game. To have a healthy metagame, we need every strategy to be represented, optimally including decks that do not perfectly align with either aggro, control or combo, but are hybrid decks. And while Dredge falls under the combo category, we cannot expect it to be a major player, as it is easily hated out by graveyard hate. This means, if we would ban Glee, our metagame will fall apart as the balance between strategies will be lost. We just talked about how this current stable metagame is, for the most part, creating a great environment to play in, with an easy entry and skill expression, but banning Brute Scale will warp the format considerably. This should not be our goal. We conclude that while Golgari Glee is currently definitely the best deck, other decks are able to compete against it, and it fulfills a very important role in this Pauper environment. So, if overthrowing the format or ripping holes in the meta is not our goal, what do we strive for? Firstly, we want to make sure to address Golgari Brute Scale. It deserves to be addressed for sure, but we want to do this in a nuanced way, not with brute force. Secondly, we dislike banning a big number of cards, as we do want to keep the environment stable and do not want to invent a completely new format. Thirdly, we do not want to unban anything that could benefit current top decks, as that would propel them far ahead. Lastly, we want to look at cards that hold back tier 3 strategies. So, what cards should we consider banning? First up, Basking Brute Scale. As mentioned before, banning the only established combo deck will mess with the overall balance of the format. Banning Brute Scale would go directly against our second goal in leaving the metagame in a stable state. Guys, let's not settle for worse than mediocre, we can do better. Let's see if we can find a different card to ban out of the Golgari Glee deck. So, what about the other colorless Eldrazi? Writhing Chrysalis. It's currently used by only 3 decks, Giant Brute Scale, Brew Monsters and Giant Wildfire. As we established previously, Giant Brute Scale is actually worse on average than Golgari. Gruul Monsters is a decent deck, but it is surely not tier 1 by any metrics. And finally Giant Wildfire, which started very strong at the beginning of the year, but as players figured out how to play against it, the deck cannot keep up with the rest of the format. So looking at all these Chrysalis decks, none of them do particularly well if compared to the rest of the meta, resulting in the word that Chrysalis is completely fine. Dispute on Ichor Wellspring enables the Pauper Ancestral Recall. 3 cards for the expense of 2 mana, but since you get 1 treasure back, you only paid 1 in total. It is the backbone of more than 30% of the online meta, and even more if you consider the paper meta. There are 2 problematic parts here. First off, the drawing 3 cards. Pauper is slow enough that 2 mana draw a card artifacts can be played, and getting the back half of the artifact enables a very high card velocity. To draw 3, you need Ichor Wellspring or Mephitic Drought, which turn 2 cards into a total of 4. The second problematic play pattern this card enables is tied to the treasure we are getting. Not only does it give you back the mana you spent, making the dispute 1 mana if you use up the mana for the next play, but also if you don't spend the mana, your card draw spell just ramped you with color fixing. Turn 1 Kindling Garden into turn 2 Deadly Dispute into a strong 4-drop like Chrysalis or Thorn of the Black-Rose, or even more forgiving, ramping into a turn 4 Avenging Hunter, is all enabled because you played a card draw spell. And even not using it enables you to protect your turn 5 statistic Glee kill, even though playing Brute Scale, the Glee, and adapting is costing you 5 mana, and you might need 1 more mana to play your Nadir's Nightblade afterwards. most junk brute scale lists play exactly one red mana source in a single mountain, but Deadly Dispute's treasure is perfectly suitable to cast Risen Chrysalis. So, if we would ban both Ica Wellspring and Mephitic Drought, we would negate some of the velocity of Dispute. This would most certainly decrease the power level of those decks. Yet this does not address the ramping and fixing part of the treasure token created by Deadly Dispute. This is why Deadly Dispute should be the ban consideration over Wellspring, as it enables these power plays with treasure ramp while the card itself is providing card advantage on top. Banning Deadly Dispute will certainly leave all the artifact decks intact. There are enough costly plunder effects that can easily replace it. But in this case, this is a good thing, as now to draw cards of these cards, you must spend the full 2 mana, negating much of the tempo the treasure provided. Banning Dispute and Dispute decks adapting similar cards mean that we 1. Have addressed Brute Scale, and 2. Did not overthrow the meta, being perfectly in line with our goals. And if Brute Scale continues to be a problem, we can still discuss different approaches, but it is better to do it step by step instead of overcompensating. Let's look at another Modern Horizons 3 card, Refurbished Familiar. If you want to show someone what power creep looks like, just show them Virus Beetle and Refurbished Familiar. Not only did Refurbished Familiar keep the artifact type, but got an improvement in all aspects of the card. Cost, strength, effect, and even a newly added keyword. This means that now this cannot be clogged up by any Augur of Bolas's, trades with Glinthawks, and the 2 damage attack power means that slow decks have to eventually deal with the flyer, leaving them down a card as they had to discard 1 at the start. No clue why everybody is mad at Risen Chrysalis, but think Refurbished Familiar is totally fine. This card single-handedly will win games against control decks. In the current world, with other high-impact cards like Chrysalis and Taurean Terror, Refurbished Familiar is a very strong card, but not out of line. So for now, it may stay. This might be a bit different when we look at Kraglan Shaman. This card was always great, but with the popularization of Death Touch granting cards, it acts like a Wrath of God effect. Kraglan Shaman in itself is not that different to Crypt Rats, but the sheer efficiency cannot be understated. Yes, you have to have 2 cards, the Shaman and the Death Touch card, but with Toxin Analysis being 1 mana and even providing the artifacts you sacrifice, and Hunter's Blowgun potentially on the battlefield way before, getting a board wipe by sacrificing artifacts to a 1 mana creature without any other mana investment is super efficient. So efficient in fact, that the existence of a Death Touching Shaman is holding back most creature decks. Kulosa is heavily impacted, and Elves or Infect decks are basically unplayable if your opponent is playing Kraglan Shaman. Even a souped up Bogle will die to a Death Touching Shaman, and not even a Bear Umbra will change any of this, as you can put 2 activations on the stack and kill the creature twice. Banning Kraglan Shaman is certainly in line with our last goal, banning cards that hold different archetypes back. Since this is a unique effect, it will leave quite the mark on the format. It is therefore not as easily justifiable as the Deadly Dispute ban, even though we predict a more diverse metagame as a result. As discussing previously, big shifts in the meta are not our goal, but banning Kraglan Shaman seems very enticing, partly because Affinity already has all the tools in the world, including other board wipes like Breath Weapon. Finally, a discussion about bans cannot be complete without talking about artifact bans. But since Affinity is not even competing for the spot of the best decks in the format, and the bridges are creatively used with Cleansing Wildfire, we are far past the conversation of banning artifact bans. This should round out the banning section, but there is still one big section still left: unbanning cards. Since we do not want to artificially boost current strong decks, we have to be careful about what cards to unban. If we do not want to bring back Storm, Turbo Initiative, or make blue tempo or affinity overpowered, most cards on the ban list are off limits. Starting with the least offensive card on the ban list, Prophetic Prism. Banned when Tron was on its peak, this artifact not only draws a card, but also fixes your mana. Since then, we came a long way. Tron decks have access to Deadly Dispute, Wizard's Rockets, and Crystal Grotto. For Tron decks with the high mana pip requirements, you can also see some network terminals, being able to fix your mana and get some value out of the looting ability. If we plan to ban Deadly Dispute, this will hurt the Tron decks because those decks rely on the treasure for colored mana. So we probably can finally bring this card from the ban list back to the format. This also would be a perfect time, as Pactor Terror looks like a very enticing card for the artifact-based Tron decks, and losing Deadly Dispute would directly catapult them back into the depths of unplayability. Another card on the ban list is Bonder's Ornament. And just from the power level on the front side, 4 mana to draw a card, in the current meta this is more than fine. But the problem lies in the second half of the card, where it states that each player that has an ornament out draws a card. Here lies the problem. If a card is barely good, we unban this card to have no impact. But if the card is good, the best card to combat Bonder's Ornament is playing one yourself. So the best case scenario would be nobody plays Ornament, And if anyone plays it, we can easily get into the spiral of everybody playing it. Alone the prospect of this occurring should deter us from unbanning the card. Let's talk about blue cards. A card that would be interesting to talk about would be High Tide. It is interesting because the only cards untapping lands in Pauper are Snap and Psychic Puppetry. The Psychic Puppetry deck is not good at all, and even High Tide cannot change that. If it would be played, we would have an uninteractive combo deck that fiddles after 10 minutes of mana counting. Not worth unbanning for this. With Snap, we can produce a combo with 4 islands and another land, playing High Tide, Archaeomancer, recasting High Tide, then snapping the Archaeomancer for infinite ETB, LTB and Magecraft triggers. Overall, this also doesn't look too appealing, both power level wise and play pattern wise. So let's just keep it on the ban list instead of unbanning High Tide, and it just lingering in the format waiting to be broken. Finally, let's look at 2 cards that could add towards the sparse combo side of the meta, so let's look at some combo options. Currently, we have Brute Scale, which requires 2 combo pieces and an outlet, and costs 3 to 5 mana to initiate the combo. Now let's talk about Peregrine Drake and Cloud of Fairies. Peregrine Drake needs Archaeomancer, Peregrine Drake and Ghostly Flicker and an outlet. The combo is not only susceptible to targeted removal, but also exposed to graveyard hate. We need at least 7 mana to play the combo. Peregrine Drake might be free, but we do need enough mana for Archaeomancer plus Ghostly Flicker. And in the end, Peregrine Drake is a 5 mana card. Good luck resolving this one. Cloud of Fairies does cost way less than only 2 mana, but also needs more setup to go infinite. Not only do we need an Archaeomancer and Ghostly Flicker, but also a way to generate the mana to pay for the Ghostly Flicker. We can do this either by playing a cost reducer or having lands in play that tap for more than 1 mana. And then we still need an outlet for our 5 card combo. Comparing the Flicker combo to Brute Scale, we can see that flickering is way more cumbersome. Therefore, let's discuss implications of a potential unban. Overall, the current Blue-White X Familiar deck does struggle with a lot of decks in the meta. Giving it a push is in our interest in bringing up decks that fell off after MH3. Therefore, it is not really the question if the Familiar combo deck will be too good, as there are enough decks that will have good matchups against it, but if there are other decks that can exploit these cards. For Peregrine Drake, it's quite clear that a 5 mana spell that kinda does nothing on its own will only be good in a combo deck, and like we evaluated previously, this will be more difficult to pull off than other options. For Cloud of Fairies, we can think of other applications, namely in fairy decks. The current mono-blue tempo fairies might use the free 1/1 flyer, but generally this shouldn't bring up the power level of the deck. No real ETB, no other synergies with the untap effect. In more control-focused decks, a free 1/1 also doesn't seem particularly crazy. Now, can there be a fairy combo hybrid deck with the amount of cards you need to dedicate to Cloud of Fairies to go infinite? This seems quite unlikely. So, if Cloud of Fairies is fine, what about Frantic Search? Well, it does have quite different purpose, as it is free card filtering. With deep analysis in the format and the new additions of Sneaky Snacker, this looks even less enticing to unban than pre-Modern Horizons. And while Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake also give you untaps, they don't get you card manipulation. With the graveyard as such a powerful tool, Frantic Search seems to hit the wrong spots, as it does not promote a lower tier deck, but instead asks how to best enable it in the current viable shades. In the end, Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake have been feared for good reason in the past, but in this current metagame, the math isn't just adding up for the Flyers. And while not being an easy or obvious unban, discussion of unbanning Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drakes are very viable. Let's recapitulate. Brute Scale is the most efficient combo that we got in recent times, but only looking at that in a vacuum will skew our perspective. This is because our fair decks are also the best they have been for a while. Refurbished Familiar, Nyxborn Hydra, Sneaky Snacker, Thraben Charm are all very strong cards. This meta and power level is very different from what we had just 1 year ago. Brute Scale is the only established combo deck in the format. This is why we do not want to outright ban Brute Scale, but instead tackle the deck by banning the best general card draw in the deck, Deadly Dispute. This will result in a lot of decks getting worse, but since we have many similar effects now, all the decks running Deadly Dispute will still function. Banning Deadly Dispute seems like the obvious choice considering all other options. Similarly, and this is probably the least contentious take of the whole video, especially in the face of a dispute ban, Prophetic Prism is totally fine to unban. Finally, Kragdan Shaman, Peregrine Drake and Cloud of Fairies. Those cards are not blatantly misplaced, but should make for an interesting discussion.